Tonight, the story begins where most accounts end, not the beginning, the end. Because the life of Abraham Lincoln only comes into full focus when you understand how it finished, when you understand what was lost, when you absorb the weight of a particular April morning in 1865 in a small, borrowed bedroom across the street from a theater in Washington, D.C. Once that weight is felt, the rest of his life looks entirely different. It is 7:22 in the morning. On April 15th, 1865, the room is small, almost absurdly small, for the occasion. A narrow bed, barely long enough for a man who stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, pushed diagonally against the wall, so his body could rest flat. 9 doctors are present, though there is nothing left for any of them to do. They have known this since the moment he arrived. The wound is fatal. It has been fatal from the start. Mary Todd Lincoln sits in a chair nearby. She has been weeping since midnight, not composed grief, but the raw, shuddering kind that rises from somewhere deeper than sorrow. She has called out to him. She has held his hand. At one point, the force of her grief prompts Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, who has taken command of the adjacent room, to have her gently removed. He cannot function under the sound of it. Stanton is already doing the work of government, interviewing witnesses, composing orders, recording his notes. He is a man who responds to crisis by becoming the crisis. Lincoln's breathing changes near dawn, slower, then slower still. Then there is nothing. Edwin Stanton looks down at the still face of Abraham Lincoln, a man he once openly mocked, then grew to admire, then came to love, and quietly, after a long silence, says what history has been repeating ever since. Now he belongs to the ages. Not to a party, not to a war, not to the living, to the ages, a man born in a one-room log cabin in the Kentucky woods, a boy who lost his mother at 9 years old, who taught himself to read by firelight, who failed in business, lost elections, buried 2 of his children, and spent 4 years holding together a nation that was quite literally tearing itself apart. That man, at 56 years old, now belonged to the ages. The war was over. Lee had surrendered 5 days before. The country Lincoln had given himself to preserve was still standing, battered and raw, but whole. And then he was gone. To understand what died that April morning, it is necessary to understand what had lived. The night before, April 14th, 1865, Good Friday, Washington was celebrating. The city had been celebrating for days. Flags hung from windows, bands played in the streets. The news of Richmond's fall and Lee's surrender at Appomattox had swept through telegraph offices across the country, and those who had lived through 4 years of war were still absorbing the fact that it was, finally, over. Abraham Lincoln, by that point, was tired in a way that 4 years of war makes a person tired, not merely sleepy, but hollowed out and rebuilt into something quieter. His face, by 1865, was visibly a different face than the one that had arrived in Washington in 1861. The 2 life masks made of Lincoln, one in 1860, one in 1865, record this with unsettling precision. The first face is sharp and angular, carrying something like ambition. The second face has been carved by something else. Grief, certainly, and the weight of responsibility, but also a quality that reads as resolve, as though a man who had traveled so deep into the dark had finally learned where the walls were. That morning, at his last cabinet meeting, Lincoln was described as being in unusually high spirits, and this is where things get strange. He told his generals and advisors he expected important news from the front because the dream had returned. Lincoln described finding himself aboard an indistinct vessel, moving rapidly through dark water toward a dark and undefined shore. He told those around him he had come to associate this dream with significant military events. It had preceded Antietam, Gettysburg, and Vicksburg. He told his cabinet, with a quality somewhere between lightness and gravity, that he expected good news soon. He was in high spirits that morning. He did not want to go to the theater that night. Lincoln told more than one person this. He was reluctant, dealing with a headache, and by some accounts had, in recent days, spoken to friends of a darker dream, not the version people usually tell. In this one, he wandered the halls of the White House, following the sound of sobbing, moving from room to room, until he found the East Room, and a body lying in state. Soldiers stood guard. A crowd of mourners wept. He asked one of the soldiers who had died. The soldier told him, the president, killed by an assassin. He went to the theater regardless. The playbills had already advertised his attendance. The people were expecting him. General Grant had declined. Grant's wife did not care for Mary Lincoln's company, though the general always cited a prior engagement. So Lincoln attended with a young couple instead, Major Henry Rathbone, 28 years old, and his fiancée, Clara Harris. The presidential carriage arrived at Ford's Theater a little after 8 in the evening. The audience rose and applauded. The orchestra played Hail to the Chief. Lincoln acknowledged them with a bow and settled into the presidential box, draped in flags and furnished with a rocking chair for his comfort. Mary Lincoln leaned on his arm, as she had during their carriage ride that afternoon. She would later recall that he had been happy that day, more at ease than he had been in years. He had already been imagining their life after the presidency, a trip to Europe, a return to Springfield, a quieter life. The play was a comedy, and Lincoln laughed at it. Real laughter. People in the audience noticed it, remembered it, and wrote about it afterward. John Wilkes Booth was 26 years old, an actor of genuine talent and striking appearance, dark-haired, pale-skinned, theatrical in manner. He was also a Confederate sympathizer of violent conviction, a man who had watched the South's defeat and concluded that what the war required was not acceptance, but a single decisive act of terror. Kill Lincoln. Kill Vice President Johnson. Kill Secretary of State Seward. Decapitate the Union government. Throw the country into chaos and give the Confederacy an opening to rise again. That was the plan. Most of it failed. The man assigned to kill Johnson spent the evening drinking in a hotel bar. The man sent to kill Seward broke into his home and slashed him severely. Seward survived, bearing the scars of that night for the rest of his life, but he did not die. Booth, however, succeeded. He knew Ford's Theater well. He had performed there. The staff recognized him. When he arrived that evening, he moved through the building without difficulty. He had come earlier in the day to prepare, at some point carving a small hole in the wall adjacent to the presidential box so he could observe Lincoln's position before entering. At around 10:15 in the evening, during the third act, a moment chosen because the audience was laughing and the noise would cover any sound, Booth stepped into the darkened corridor behind the presidential box. Lincoln's bodyguard, Officer John Parker, was not at his post. Parker had left his position earlier in the evening. The door to the box was unguarded. Booth pushed it open. He raised a small, single-shot Derringer pistol, the kind of weapon that fits in a coat pocket without attracting attention, and fired it at the back of Abraham Lincoln's head from a distance of perhaps 3 feet. The bullet entered behind Lincoln's left ear and lodged behind his right eye. Lincoln slumped forward in the rocking chair. Mary Lincoln screamed. Major Rathbone lunged at Booth, and Booth slashed him deeply in the arm with a knife before vaulting over the railing. His spur caught on the flag draped over the box, and he landed awkwardly on the stage 12 feet below, breaking a bone in his left leg. He stood up regardless, faced the audience, which had gone completely silent, and shouted something. Witnesses disagreed on the exact words, though most recalled something close to sic semper tyrannis, the Virginia state motto, meaning thus always to tyrants. He then limped off into the wings and out of the building. The audience sat for a moment in a silence so complete it seemed as though everyone was waiting for the scene to make sense. A young doctor named Charles Leal, 23 years old, attending the theater specifically because he had heard Lincoln would be present and wanted to see the president, rushed to the box. He found Lincoln unresponsive. Mary Todd holding his head, Leal understood at once that the wound was fatal. He cleared the wound and administered a crude form of artificial respiration, and Lincoln drew breath again, faint and labored, but present. Leal knew what that breathing meant. He was not witnessing a recovery. He was keeping Lincoln alive long enough for the man to die with some measure of dignity, somewhere other than a theater floor. 6 men carried Lincoln out of Ford's Theater and across 10th Street in the rain to a boarding house owned by a man named William Peterson. A boarder led them to a small back room. They laid Lincoln diagonally on the bed. He remained there through the night. 14 doctors came and went. Cabinet members stood in the hallway. Mary Lincoln moved in and out of the room. The Secretary of War turned the adjacent room into a functioning office of state. Lincoln never regained consciousness. At 7:22 in the morning, he died. This is a story about what gets lost. But before anything else, it is a story about how extraordinary it was that Abraham Lincoln existed at all. That a boy from a log cabin in Kentucky became that man in that theater box. That journey is not simple, not clean, and not the tidy ascent of a man moving inevitably toward greatness. It is messier than that, more instructive than that. February 12th, 1809. Hardin County, Kentucky, a place that no longer exists by that name, now LaRue County, in a part of the country that in 1809 was still considered the western frontier. The land was heavily forested, the winters hard, the nearest town miles away over roads that became rivers of mud in the rain. Into this world, in a one-room log cabin on a farm called Sinking Spring, Abraham Lincoln was born. The cabin had one room, one window, a dirt floor, and a fireplace that when it worked heated perhaps a quarter of the interior. Thomas Lincoln, the father, had built it himself, as he had built most things in his life, with his hands, available tools, and the stubborn competence of a frontier farmer who never quite caught a break. Thomas Lincoln was not a bad man. History has sometimes treated him harshly, and his son would grow cold toward him in adulthood, refusing to attend either his deathbed or his funeral, and speaking of him in ways that suggest something more than ordinary estrangement. But Thomas was a man of his time, for whom reading was a luxury, formal education was an ornament, and survival was the only real currency. He was also, for all his difficulties, a man who kept moving. The family eventually lost their Kentucky farm, not to poor farming, but to legal disputes over land titles. The chaotic patchwork of frontier law meant that the same plot of ground might carry 3 or 4 competing claims, and Thomas Lincoln had neither the money nor the connections to prevail in those disputes. He lost hundreds of acres in Kentucky this way. When Abraham was 7, the family relocated to Indiana, where land titles under federal law were more reliable. They settled in a place called Little Pigeon Creek in Spencer County in southwestern Indiana. Thomas built what was known as a half-faced camp upon arrival, not quite a cabin, more like a 3-walled shelter with one side open to the elements, fronted by a fire. The family lived in this through a brutal Indiana winter. A proper cabin eventually went up, but proper is a generous description of what it was. Abraham Lincoln would later describe his Indiana childhood as the short and simple annals of the poor. He was not exaggerating. In the autumn of 1818, when Abraham Lincoln was 9 years old, his mother died. Her name was Nancy Hanks Lincoln, and she died of milk sickness, a disease caused by drinking the milk of cows that had grazed on white snakeroot, a poisonous plant common in the Indiana woods. Several people in the community died of it that season. Nancy was among them. She was 34 years old. Lincoln spoke of his mother rarely in adult life, and what he said when he did was spare and enormous. He credited her with everything good in him. He believed she had shaped his character in ways he never fully traced but always felt. His sister Sarah, 11 years old, took over the running of the household. Abraham performed farm labor. Thomas Lincoln, overwhelmed, made the decision to travel back to Kentucky to find a new wife. He returned with a widow named Sarah Bush Johnston, who brought her 3 children, her furniture, and, crucially, her books. Sarah Bush Johnston Lincoln is one of the quiet figures this story cannot do without. She recognized something in Abraham almost immediately, not just intelligence, though that was plain, but a particular depth and hunger for understanding that she identified as worth protecting. She encouraged his reading. She pushed back when Thomas regarded all the book learning as idleness. She said of her stepson years after his death that he was the best boy I ever saw. Lincoln called her his angel mother. His formal education, across all the years it could be accumulated, amounted to roughly 12 months. Attended across stretches of time at local blab schools, named for the method of having students recite lessons aloud together, suited to teaching many children with a single teacher in one room. Those 12 months were all the schooling he ever received. Everything else he took for himself. He read the Bible, Aesop's Fables, a neighbor's legal textbook, a biography of George Washington, the poems of Robert Burns. He walked miles to borrow books and miles back to return them. His cousin Dennis Hanks, who lived with the family for a time, recalled Lincoln as always reading, always writing, always studying, and considered this a kind of mild madness. Thomas Lincoln was blunter about it. "I tried to stop it," Thomas reportedly said, "but he got that fool idea into his head, and it can't be got out." The image that survives from these years, a boy writing his letters in charcoal on a wooden shovel because paper was scarce, copying out arithmetic problems by hand because he could not keep the borrowed book long enough to study it, describes, by every reasonable measure of the frontier world he was born into, a young man whose prospects were fixed. He would farm, he would stay within or near Indiana, and he would live and die within perhaps 100 miles of where he was born, as virtually everyone around him did. He had no money, no connections, no formal schooling, and a father who actively discouraged self-improvement. What he had was a mind that would not stop and a temperament that would outlast nearly anything the world placed against it. In 1828, his sister Sarah died. She was 21 years old, and she died in childbirth. It affected Lincoln in a particular way that people close to him could still detect years later. He had now lost, before the age of 20, the two people who had understood him best. In 1830, the family relocated again, this time to Illinois, following reports of good land and seeking distance from another threat of milk sickness. Abraham was 21. This time, when the family settled, he did not settle with them. He was done with the farm. He took a job assisting a man named Denton Offutt in taking a flatboat of goods down the Mississippi to New Orleans, a journey of roughly 1,200 miles. And it was on this trip that Lincoln encountered the full reality of American slavery in its daily, commercial, unremarkable form. The slave markets of New Orleans. Human beings sold and separated on auction blocks with the business-like efficiency of any other commodity transaction. He did not speak at length about what he saw, and he did not need to. The record of the following 35 years makes the impression legible enough. New Salem, Illinois. This is where Abraham Lincoln became the man, not yet the president, but the thinker, the lawyer, the politician, the storyteller. Lincoln was funny. This tends to surprise people who know him primarily from photographs. Those exhausted wartime faces looking out of daguerreotypes with what appears to be unbroken solemnity. But Lincoln in life was enormously and deliberately funny. He collected stories and jokes as a craftsman collects tools, and he deployed them with a timing that consistently astonished those who witnessed it. His humor was self-deprecating, earthy, sometimes strikingly crude, and entirely genuine. He used it to disarm, to connect, to diffuse, and to cope. He ran for the Illinois state legislature in 1832 and lost. He ran again in 1834 and won. During these years, he studied law on his own, borrowing books and reading them in every spare moment, until in 1836 he passed the bar examination and became a licensed attorney. All of it, without a single day of formal legal education. He moved to Springfield, Illinois in 1837 and made his way into a social scene that included, as it turned out, Mary Todd. Mary Todd is not who people tend to imagine when they picture Lincoln's wife. She was educated at a private school in Lexington, Kentucky. She spoke French, read widely, and held firm opinions about politics. She had also, at various points, been courted by Stephen Douglas, the Little Giant himself, the most prominent Democrat in Illinois. She chose Lincoln instead. Or more precisely, Lincoln chose her, lost his nerve, withdrew, spent approximately a year in what friends described as a borderline psychological collapse, and then found his way back to her. They married on November 4th, 1842. Someone reportedly asked Lincoln where he was going, dressed up and heading out the door. He answered, according to the story, "To hell, I reckon." They had 4 sons together: Robert, Edward, William, Thomas. Edward died at 3 years old in 1850. William died in the White House in 1862 at 11, while his father was fighting a war. Thomas, called Tad, survived the presidency. Robert lived until 1926, and then Stephen Douglas, the man Mary Todd had not married, changed that. In 1854, Douglas pushed through Congress the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which effectively dismantled the Missouri Compromise of 1820 and opened the door for slavery to spread north of the line that had once contained it. Lincoln's response was not performative, not merely political. It was genuine, moral, and personal. He had opposed slavery since witnessing the New Orleans auction blocks at 19. He had believed for decades that it was wrong, not as a regional problem to be managed, not as an economic inconvenience, but as a fundamental offense against the principle that all men are created equal. He came back into politics. 7 debates followed, held across 7 towns in Illinois between August and October of 1858. Crowds in the thousands attended each one, 12,000 in Ottawa, 16,000 in Galesburg, and newspapers across the country printed the full transcripts. The physical contrast between the two men was almost theatrical. Douglas stood perhaps 5 feet 4 inches, barrel-chested, expensively dressed, and spoke with a voice like a cannon. Lincoln was 8 inches taller, rail-thin, wearing clothes that never quite fit a man of his proportions, and speaking in a voice that was not booming but carried with unusual clarity. He was not a beautiful orator in the classical sense. He was something more useful. He was relentlessly clear, with a demonstrated gift for taking a tangled thing and making it simple without making it false. At Freeport, Lincoln posed a question designed to place Douglas in an untenable position. He asked Douglas to reconcile popular sovereignty with the Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision, which had ruled that Congress had no authority to prohibit slavery in the territories. If Congress itself could not ban slavery, how could the mere vote of a territory's citizens do so? Douglas answered, and in answering, he told the South that popular sovereignty offered no guarantee of their institutions' survival. Lincoln had what he needed. Lincoln lost the Senate race, but what the debates had produced was something larger than a Senate seat. They were published as a book, sold 16,000 copies, and established Lincoln as a national figure. When the Republican National Convention convened in Chicago in May 1860, Abraham Lincoln, the self-educated son of a Kentucky log cabin, was chosen as the Republican nominee for President of the United States. The 1860 election was defined by fracture. 4 candidates ran. Lincoln won without carrying a single Southern state. In 10 of the 15 slave states, his name did not appear on the ballot at all. He received 39.8% of the popular vote, a plurality, not a majority, but carried enough of the North and West to win the Electoral College comfortably. Before he was even inaugurated, 7 Southern states had seceded. By the time Lincoln boarded the train from Springfield to Washington in February 1861, he knew he was possibly traveling toward a war. He said something close to this, quietly, to the people who came to see him off. He asked them to remember him. He was inaugurated on March 4th, 1861. His first inaugural address reached across the growing division with language that was simultaneously a plea and a promise, closing with words that approached poetry. The mystic chords of memory will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature. 1 month later, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter, South Carolina. The war began. The Civil War lasted 4 years. The number of deaths it produced, estimates range from roughly 620,000 to 750,000, exceeded American casualties in any other war before or since, including both world wars combined, if counted by American losses alone. Lincoln lived with this every day. He read the casualty reports. He visited the hospitals. He signed letters to the families of the dead, hundreds, then thousands, and his secretaries recalled him becoming more withdrawn after those sessions, more hollowed out, the weight of each name pressing on him in ways he could not escape. He sometimes wandered to the telegraph office near the White House late at night, waiting for dispatches from the front, unable to sleep. He slept very little during the war. He lost weight. He aged visibly and dramatically. The two life masks record 5 years of that weight better than any photograph could. He was also a more capable war president than most people had anticipated. When the war began, Lincoln had no military experience beyond his brief and bloodless militia service in the Black Hawk War. He was not a battlefield tactician, but he possessed something that many of his generals did not: patience, and the ability to hold an enormous strategic picture in mind without losing it to the details of any single engagement. He also had the political instinct to hold together a coalition of extraordinary fragility: radical Republicans, moderate Republicans, border state loyalists, and Northern Democrats who opposed the war outright. He held this coalition together for 4 years. And somewhere in the course of those 4 years, he changed. When Lincoln entered the war, his stated purpose was to preserve the Union. Slavery was secondary. He said so directly in a letter to newspaper editor Horace Greeley in August 1862. "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." That was not the position of a man on a crusade for abolition. It was the position of a man trying to prevent a country from disintegrating. The war, however, was teaching him. The sight of enslaved men escaping to Union lines, offering their labor, their knowledge of Confederate territory, their willingness to fight, was teaching him. And something else, quieter and harder to name, was teaching him as well. He was encountering in direct and unavoidable ways the human reality of slavery, not as a political abstraction. On September 22, 1862, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. The Battle of Antietam, the bloodiest single day of the entire war at approximately 23,000 casualties, gave Lincoln the moment he required. On January 1st, 1863, the final Emancipation Proclamation was signed. In Union-held Beaufort, South Carolina, a colonel read the proclamation aloud to a crowd that included newly freed people. As he finished, an elderly man in the crowd began to sing. 2 women's voices joined him, then more. "My country, 'tis of thee." January 1st had long been known among the enslaved as Heartbreak Day, the date on which slave auctions were commonly held. After 1863, it was called something else. A Day of Deliverance, November 19th, 1863. Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. He was not the featured speaker. That role belonged to Edward Everett, who spoke for 2 hours and 12 minutes. Lincoln spoke for 2 minutes. His address was 272 words. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. 77 years, 87. 1863 minus 87 is 1776. The Declaration of Independence, not the Constitution. Lincoln was reaching back before the legal founding of the country to its stated moral foundation. He ended that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. 2 minutes, Everett wrote to Lincoln the following day, "I should be glad if I could flatter myself that I came as near to the central idea of the occasion in 2 hours as you did in 2 minutes." Lincoln initially believed the speech had failed. He told a friend it was a flat failure. He was not seeking reassurance. He genuinely believed it. He was wrong about this, as he sometimes was. His second inaugural address, delivered March 4th, 1865, is among the most consequential political speeches ever delivered on American soil. It is short, it is not a victory address, it does not exalt, and it does not condemn. He spoke of the war with a directness unusual for a wartime leader. Both parties deprecated war, but one of them would make war rather than let the nation survive, and the other would accept war rather than let it perish. And the war came. And he closed. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds. With malice toward none. This, from a man who had spent 4 years being called a tyrant, a guerrilla, a dictator, a clown, and a fool, who had been burned in effigy, who had received death threats so regularly that his secretaries eventually stopped showing them to him because there were too many. Most historians who have studied Lincoln closely have concluded that those words were genuine, that this was not a man performing high-mindedness for history's benefit, but a man who had spent 4 years watching the damage that hatred produces, and had arrived at the conclusion that he would not allow himself to become it. After Appomattox, Lincoln visited Richmond, the former Confederate capital. He arrived with minimal security and walked through the still smoking streets of the city, accompanied largely by his son, Tad, who was 12 years old. Former enslaved people gathered around him, some weeping, some reaching out to touch him. Lincoln removed his hat. He then spent 5 hours at a military hospital, moving through ward after ward, shaking hands with the wounded. Thousands of handshakes. He left with his right hand so swollen and sore he could barely lift it. He returned to Washington, and on the morning of April 14th, his final morning, told his cabinet about the ship dream, the dark water, the vessel moving fast, the approaching shore. That afternoon, he rode in a carriage with Mary. She asked him why he seemed so happy. He said he had done his job. The war was over. They could rest now. He was reluctant to go to the theater. He went anyway. Booth was hunted down 12 days later, hiding in a tobacco barn in Virginia. The barn was set on fire. Booth, refusing to come out, was shot through a gap in the boards and died a few hours later. Lincoln's body traveled home to Springfield, Illinois, on a train that retraced, roughly, the route he had taken to Washington 4 years before. The same cities, the same stops, the same crowds, now in mourning instead of celebration. In Philadelphia, 300,000 people viewed Lincoln's body lying in state. In New York, 1 million. The procession through New York City took 4 hours. A small boy of 6, watching from a second-floor window of his grandfather's house on Broadway, watched the procession pass and carried the memory of it for the rest of his life. His name was Theodore Roosevelt. He would one day be president as well. Lincoln was buried at Oak Ridge Cemetery in Springfield on May 4th, 1865. He was 56 years old. He had been president for 4 years and 42 days. Lincoln is compelling not because he was flawless. He was not. His early positions on race were complicated and evolved under pressure and across time, and some of what he said during his debates with Douglas regarding the social equality of Black Americans would, if quoted fairly today, fall well short of what the moment required. He was not an abolitionist from the beginning. He arrived there slowly, guided by events and by the moral force of those around him, among them Frederick Douglass, who met with Lincoln in the White House and later said that Lincoln was the first great man who had ever made him feel entirely at ease. He was not immune to depression, to failure, to the pettiness of politics, or to the loneliness of leadership. Grief ran through his life like a cold current beneath everything else. He is compelling because of all of that, because he was a man with every reason to become bitter or diminished or rigid, and he did not. A boy who grew up in poverty, who lost his mother and then his sister, who failed in business and lost elections, who held a fragmenting country together by the force of something that was not quite optimism and not quite despair. Something he expressed in his own words as simply, "Hold on." He held on. 4 years of the bloodiest war in American history, 4 years of being called every name a man can be called, 4 years of insufficient sleep, insufficient food, and more grief than any person should be asked to carry. And he held on. When it was over, 5 days after it was over, he was gone. Think about what it means that a boy from a one-room log cabin in Kentucky became what he became. 12 months of formal schooling, a wooden shovel for a writing surface, books walked miles to borrow and miles back to return, and from those materials, a mind that produced the Gettysburg Address. Think about the grief he carried and the humor he carried alongside it. Both of them real, both of them necessary. The legend of Lincoln says, great man, log cabin to presidency, savior of the Union. The actual record says, a complicated man, carrying enormous grief, with 12 months of formal schooling and the long, deliberate labor of becoming someone whose words still carry weight 160 years later. A man who said, with malice toward none, and by every serious account, meant it. Lincoln has been gone for a long time, but what he said, what he chose to do, and what he chose to become out of the raw and genuinely difficult materials of his life, that has not gone anywhere. It is still here, like the memory of firelight, like the sound of a train moving through a city in the dark, with hundreds of thousands of people standing along the tracks to watch it pass. Good night.